Go ahead, Senator Bell.
Well, thank you for your presentation. And getting back to my theme of helping our most needy. When I worked with the great speaker Karen Bass, who you work with, we worked on the foster care transitional housing program, and also I want to point out that it was Senator Bruce McPherson that worked on that program also. And what we have is a program for the transitional foster youth. What we don't have is the same kind of program for homeless youth that are not in the foster care program. Okay, so there's about, we don't know how many there are, they're going to count them, but we think there's about maybe 250,000 kids running around homeless in California. We're not sure how many, but we're trying to count that. There, of course, these are the most difficult group in the homeless to count. You can't find them. They don't want you to find them. They're running away. So I was wondering, in terms of the Mental Health Service Act, I just got appointed to be on that commission. What can we do to better utilize the funds of the Mental Health Services Act, given the fact that a lot of changes are going to happen now that we have the Hoover Commission, and they're going to insist on accountability standards. They're going to insist on outcome measurements for what the commission's doing at both the statewide allocation for that and then the county allocation. So can you maybe I'm digging into your past life here, right? Because I know you worked on some of these things. So
why, thank you.
I want maybe both of you to react to that.
Okay,
that
and I think we both can.
So I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
The original allocation that came to us was, like I said, about $400 million,
yeah.
And our agreement with DHS expires in 2016. We did this all via an executive order and a memorandum of understanding with the department, and frankly, the program has operated very well, but there are some more efficiencies that we would be recommending if we were to continue on in our role as administering those MHSA funds. Also, we would need some minimum allocations in order to make that work. And so right now, we're dependent upon the counties agreeing or volunteering a portion of their funds back to us so that we could do the housing program. So there would have to be a minimum allocation that came for housing to be able to continue to make that program work. I think we would have to continue on with our collaboration, and that would be between all of the agencies, because a lot of what we have been able to do using the MHSA funds is to pair that with our lending or either other subsidies that are available. Some of these MHSA programs our developments have come in where, to keep the debt low, they've received no construction financing, and it's just been MHSA dollars with HCD dollars. And so to continue along the lines with those collaboration efforts so that we're putting our resources together to make that happen.
There's a lot of nonprofit organizations that are willing to work on providing permanent housing for homeless, mentally ill youth. I often think that, why do we describe these youth as anything other than homeless? Because they're running away and they're out there, and we shouldn't put stigmas on them. Of course, that's one of the rules about solving our mental health problems. But it seems to me that the Mental Health Services Act can do more for these young people that are homeless in our state, and we can actually do something rather immediately if we really put our minds to it. In my opinion, I don't know what your thoughts are on that. In terms of maybe expanding the THC Plus program to include homeless youth, for example. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think one of the biggest issues is that is not available is the rental subsidies and the operating subsidies for housing. Yeah. I can use my 4% tax credits and my financing to be able to provide capital. Claudia can use some of her money, and that was allocated to her via bond funds to do capital. But what we're in need of is a flexible revenue stream that can help support and provide those permanent supportive housing units and those units that provide those services, that rental subsidy and that operating subsidy that would go in connection with the capital development to make these developments work.
Okay.
And just to add, one of the things that we've been conceiving of when we dream about having more money is a health housing innovation fund that would basically make sure that we do the research and analysis and then formulate the programs that could serve populations like you were mentioning with youth that are not in our foster care program but really need assistance and services in order to change the path of their lives.
Right.
So we're really doing a serious effort in that way because we're increasingly looking at the connections between health and housing and how a stable and affordable home means so much with regard to changing someone's life around.
Yes.
Stability of the housing.
Yes, I think it requires the counties, because they have all the center bases, correct? We're, the county board members here on the committee here, but they have all the social service infrastructure. If that can be combined with closer coordination with housing organizations, I think we can attack this problem directly and come up with some answers. I think that's something we want to work with you on. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rolfe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Director, thank you. Given the fact that we may not have securely nailed down the funding for the supportive services component of the Prop 41 transitional and supportive housing, is there any way to tap part of the $50 million that remains under the Mental Health Services Act to help fund some of that effort, or are we looking at a general fund appropriation? Has administration given any thought to this?
Well, currently the MHSA dollars are available and would be available to help support in the capital, not necessarily the services, but the operating and a rental subsidy that may be necessary for that veterans housing. MHSA could be used and combined with that, and we are envisioning that it would be used in combination with that. On the services side, we know that California and several of our housing authorities have been allocated VASH vouchers, which are the Veterans Assistance Supportive Housing dollars, which are it's like Section 8 program, but it's specifically for homeless veterans or veterans that are at risk of homeless, and it comes with a very valuable support services component. And so we're also envisioning that as we go forward in our application process, that those jurisdictions that are bringing their VASH vouchers to the project will be more competitive, and that is a way of us looking at leveraging all of our funds and having our funds work together. Capital funds, perhaps the operating subsidy dollars coming from Mental Health Services Act, if some of the veterans were actually creating veterans but Mental Health Service Unit Acts, and then the local jurisdictions through their federal allocation of VASH vouchers being able to bring in a rental subsidy that provides for the extra supportive services.
So that essentially provides for the structure, I think. Maybe I'm missing the boat, but what actually then pays for what I consider supportive services, whether it's substance abuse counseling, mental health treatment, and the like, where you have these, in this case, for Prop 41, you have veterans in transitional and supportive housing, and we need to get them stabilized and move them on to hopefully productive lives. So there's a human services piece of this. I realize that's not your that's not your department, ma'am, or your department, but it is mental health services in a sense.
Right, and so when you look at the model that we used and T is now using for the mental health services housing, we were able to what we call capitalize those funds over time. So we put that in the loan stack. So that became part of the structure of the loan, and then over time the project could have a continual operating subsidy, pay the rent, the electricity, and a number of other things, including supportive services. A large factor in success was an on-site manager for some of these projects. So in the veterans, we have to figure out another way to do that, because the restrictions on the bond money are different than they were for the original MHSA money. We're continuing to work on that, but we realize how critical a component it is of success. It's not just housing, it's making sure that those services, and when Tia mentioned the VASH, that comes with a service component, it's cobbling those together.
Right. And I think the piece, because we have put our financing together and we've taken some of those costs that would have traditionally been softer money that would have gone to services and capitalized those, that allows the development to free up additional money to be able to provide for those support services. And each of our supportive housing units requires a service provider and a service plan that goes along with it. But by restacking the way we finance, the goal was to help free up some money on the back end so that the developer would be able to provide some of those costs for services out of the money that we freed up for them.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And I do have a couple of follow-up questions as well. On the Keep Your Home California program, it's my understanding that if the $1.8 billion are not used up or are not distributed by 2017, the remainder, the balance, will be returned to the federal government. Do you foresee that we're on track to distributing the entire amount?
Yes, and we've distributed about half now, so we only have about $900 million. Is that right, Di? About $900 million left. We are on track. We look at that data on a monthly basis. With some of the new tweaks to our program that we've showed with the new senior pilot program that we're rolling out. But we're continuing, as we constantly are reviewing our data to ensure that we're going to be utilizing those funds. Early on in the program, we saw that the matched requirement for our mortgage assistance was not working, so we removed that. Early on in the program, we saw that anything that we required the banks to participate, to actively do something, that we weren't having much luck with that. So we're constantly looking at our programs, tweaking our programs, and I'd have to say, out of all of the fund, we received the largest amount of those dollars in the nation, and we've been constantly commented on how effectively we've run our programs, and so I do believe we're on track and that we will be spending every last dime of that money.
Absolutely, sounds good. Now, second question, it's my understanding that several years ago the agency called HFA was downgraded on its credit rating because of the fact that it was involved in a number of variable rate transactions. What is the current credit rating for the agency at this point?
Well, did you see my wonderful little A's?
That was A+.
Yes, and I have my risk manager here too, if he'd like to collaborate.
A-,
a little bit more.
oh, okay, good.
But isn't that great? Yes, we got A's. Yes, and that was as a result of on our single family side, we did receive significant losses, and we have worked very hard and diligently over the last several years, and I believe that has been a vote in confidence to our staffing and the administration of our programs, and a special thanks to our financing division. We have a brilliant finance team who has helped us in our most recent credit ratings. I think our most recent one that came out was Moody's with the A3 up from a BAA. Yay!
Good job. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, if there are no further questions, I'd like to thank the two ladies. If you're welcome to stay at the desk if you so desire, and while I invite the next speaker to come on up. The next speaker is Mr. Mark Stivers, who is the Executive Director of the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee, TCAC for short. Mr. Stivers, anytime you're ready, you may proceed.
Great. Thank you again, Mark Stivers, and I'm very pleased to be back in the building, and I hope you'll forgive me if I feel a little turned around today. For the last 16 years, I spent sitting on the other side of the dais across the hall as a consultant to the Senate Transportation and Housing Committee, and generally I didn't say much, so today is going to be a fully new role for me. So our agency, the Tax Credit Allocation Committee, is a little bit different from HCD and Cal HFA that we just discussed, and even CIDLAC, who will come behind me. We really do. They all have multiple programs serving multiple purposes. Really do one thing. We are part of the financing of affordable rental housing. We don't have home ownership. We don't anyway. So we do one program, and in both the federal and the state government have decided that affordable rental housing is a priority need in the community. It's of vital importance, and so both have allowed for a certain amount of tax credits that are available to entities that invest in and develop affordable housing. And so our role really is to allocate those credits among competing projects in some cases, and in others make sure that people are complying with the rules. So we do one thing. We do have 3 different flavors of tax credits. I'll get into that in a second, but really we're focused on that. We are housed in the State Treasurer's Office. We are not part of the Governor's administration per se, but ultimately we are, the committee is a committee of 3. It includes the Treasurer as the chair, the State Controller, and the Department of Finance representing the Governor. So it is sort of a somewhat independent entity that is allied with both the three statewide elected officials. So my role here today really is just to explain, give you an overview of sort of how the tax credit program works. And so, again, the tax credit program is meant to incent private behavior. We are asking private investors to invest in affordable housing. For that, they obviously get the economic benefit of the tax credits. So really, it's an indirect public funding source. What Cal HFA and HCD do, they give out money directly to developers. We allow a developer to get a tax credit. The developer, though, often is a nonprofit, or even if they're a for-profit, doesn't have nearly enough tax liability to use that credit themselves. And so what they do is they invite in private corporations to invest in their project with an equity investment. When people put in equity, we don't have to pay monthly mortgage payments. We don't pay debt service on that, and it allows us to keep the rents down because our costs are low and not having to service debt. The tax credits are main things that the investors are after. They also do get some other benefits from being owners of the property. And so the way these are structured is that the developer and the corporation sort of form a limited liability company. They're sort of partners in a partnership, and the investors take the tax credits, but they also participate in the losses of the project and the depreciation of the project. So when we get to the pricing of tax credits later on, that'll become important. So the developers are actually, or the investors are getting a little bit more benefit than just the tax credits in and of themselves. So on the federal side, there really are 2 types of tax credits. One is, under the federal law, it's called 70% of present value. We commonly refer to that as a 9% tax credit. It used to be that the rate that was applied was 9%. I'll get to at the bottom of the slide. It's now less, but it's still referred to as a 9% credit. That is a competitive program. We are allocated a certain amount of tax credits each year by the federal government, and it's very competitive. It's oversubscribed, so we have a point scoring system, and we sort of figure out which projects best meet our criteria and get funded. Federal law also provides for this 30% present value tax credit, which we call the 4% tax credit, and that is unlimited. And it derives from the fact that the projects are paying 50% of their development costs with tax-exempt bonds, which my Jerry Glasser will come up and talk about next. So we partner on those projects with SIDLAC, who will come up. The credits that people earn are a function of the basis in the project. It's generally development costs minus land. And so that's how the amount of tax credits that people can utilize is a function of sort of the cost of developing the project minus the cost of land. So again, as I mentioned, there's a certain amount of tax credits that the federal law allows. Right now it's $2.30 per person. When you multiply that out, we have $88.5 million in federal 9% tax credits to allocate this year. But in reality, when we allocate $1 of a tax credit to a project, it really means that project gets to take, or the investors in that project get to take $1 tax credit for each of the next 10 years. So that $88.5 million really is really an $885 million resource that we're talking about on the 9% tax credit side. It is a competitive. Last year we had 173 applications. We were only able to fund 83 of the projects, so it's about a little bit less than 2-to-1 oversubscription rate. We did those tax credits did ultimately create 4,846 affordable rental housing units, and almost 90 or 80% of those were new construction. Again, we have a great housing need in California, and so we were actually increasing supply with those. We have 2 rounds that we do each year in terms of our competition, and just on terms of the units, when we get to the 4% side, we create another 9,000 units, although many of those are actually rehabilitations of existing projects. So again, just to walk you through a little bit of the math, sorry about that, but So on the 9% side, let's assume you have a project that costs $13 million to develop. $3 million of that is land. You don't get tax credits based on the value of the land, so the tax credits are calculated based on $10 million in this eligible basis that we talked about briefly. Again, it's not a 9% factor that we use right now. We're using a 7.5% factor, so that generates $750,000 in annual credits. And again, those are each year for 10 years. So this $10 million project, when they use 9% tax credits, would get 7.5 essentially million in tax credits that they would offer then to investors. On the 4% side, it's similar math. It's just that the factor is a lot less, right? So instead of a 7.5% credit, it's really a 2% credit. That same project on the 4% side would not generate 7.5 million in tax credits. It would really be 3.2 million. And we'll talk later about one of the opportunities that exist. That gap between those two is something that somehow has to be filled, and we'll talk about how we can do that. So again, when we give credits to a project, that's not necessarily exactly the amount of money that comes in. Again, these credits are sort of offered to investors who buy into the project, and they sort of pay a certain price for that. That pricing is sort of it's a market. It's priced in the market. There's a lot of competition for those projects. There's supply and demand. The price goes up and down. It does vary a lot by location and by project type. The major investor in tax credits are banks. And so if a bank, they're much more interested in funding projects in a community reinvestment area than they are sort of in non-CRA areas, and so the pricing is much higher in those locations. And what we're seeing on the federal side right now is actually for each dollar of tax credit, we're seeing $1.05, $1.10, even $1.15 invested into these projects for each dollar of federal tax credit right now. There are some cases in rural areas particularly where it might be lower than $1, but in most cases in California we have very strong pricing. And again, just to go back to our math example then, that $7.5 million in tax credits that 9% project was awarded, if we assume it got $1.05 for each dollar of credit, that would be $7.87 million coming into that project to help fund the construction of it. So again, we've talked about federal tax credits so far, but we also have the legislature and the governor have approved a state tax credit as well, going back to about 1987, I believe. The amount in statute is $70 million per year, but it is indexed for inflation. So right now we are allocating about $87 million in state tax credits each year. But unlike the federal credits, you do not multiply these by 10. This is a one-time amount. When we give a dollar of tax credit, that dollar is realized as a tax credit over 4 years, but it's in total $1. So it is different from the federal law in that way. And the reality is about 95% of the tax credits that we administer are federal, but the 5% here is actually very important. It allows us to it allows us to stretch our pool and sort of do more projects. The pricing on state tax credits is a lot different. You start sort of at a base of 65 cents on the dollar, and that's because when we reduce an investor's state taxes, they don't deduct that from their federal taxes, so they end up paying more federal taxes. There's a 35% corporate tax rate, and so the investors will pay 65 cents because that's essentially the benefit to them. So the state credits, currently we really only put them into projects that are either in qualified census tracts, which tend to be areas of the state that are economically challenged, or in difficult to develop areas, which are areas of the state where it's very costly to do construction. And that actually, both of those cover a good portion of the state. But more importantly, we have a geographical distribution program. We make sure credits get out to each part of the state based on sort of a formula. And when we are figuring our geographic distribution, the state credits are added into that pool. So even if a certain area isn't getting state credits per se, they are getting more federal credits to offset for that. So that the state credit is a benefit statewide, even if it's not going into individual projects in all areas of the state. One of the changes that the legislature did was AB 952 from 2013. It allowed state credits to support special needs housing projects in the difficult to develop areas. And as a result, last year, we really increased the amount of demand for the state credits. We were oversubscribed last year for the state credits. And again, projects that we've historically done, but we also then funded a larger number of special needs projects with supportive services for people. disabled persons, and others. The last thing I want to talk about then is sort of the opportunity that I think is before us. We have, as Jeree Glasser-Hedrick from SIDLAC will come up and discuss in just a second, we do have a large amount of tax-exempt bond authority available to us. And as I talked about early on, the 4% tax credits come automatically when we allocate any of that tax-exempt bond authority to rental housing. And so we have an untapped, we have a large amount of untapped bond authority. It means we're leaving those 4% credits on the table. And there are things that we're looking at doing administratively that would try to would sort of promote production on the 4% side, things that might reduce costs on our side that can help make some more projects feasible, and that will help with the margins. But the main reason that those 4% projects and those tax-exempt bonds aren't used is that there's that gap that we were talking about, right? The 9% project, the 9% tax credits brought in $7.87 million. The 4% project brought in $3.2 million in equity. Somehow you got to figure out that gap. And you can meet some of it by raising the rents, right? The higher the rents you charge, the more incomes come in, the more debt you can have on the property. But we're an affordable housing program. And if you want to provide the affordable housing, you have to sort of fund that gap some way. And so, you know, I know this year, but probably before you will be proposals to provide funding for affordable housing. We have a bill already on the state tax credits. Whether it's funding through HCD's multifamily housing program or an additional tax credits or a permanent source that you know, funds a lot of ways, it's not really important what color of the money it is. It's just that there has to be some sort of gap subsidy program there for us to be able to draw down those federal resources. Otherwise, we are leaving things on the table and not meeting the affordable housing needs in this state that are so dire. So that's, anyway, that was the one opportunity we have. That's an overview of the program, and I'm very happy to sort of answer any questions that folks have. Or we can just have Jeree come up, my partner, at the Treasurer's office.
Any questions? Senator Roth.
Sir, is the administration supportive of increasing the state tax credit? I mean, it seems to me that would certainly be one way to help close this gap.
Well, I don't work for the administration. I end up working for the state treasurer.
That certainly would help, though.
If the administration were supportive and we were able to increase the tax credits, it would help us bridge that gap. That is correct.
Have there been discussions between the two entities?
Not that I'm aware of at this time. I think we're expecting a package of bills to come out. There's one already by Assemblyman Chu, but we're expecting a package of bills to come out on affordable housing financing in the next week or so, and I would imagine that would be the start of those discussions.
Because some of us have attempted to increase money for affordable housing in the past, and of course the stakeholders come out, various stakeholders come out with spears, and some of us don't survive without mortal wounds, so we certainly need some backup from somebody if we're going to tackle this thing.
Yes, and I was part of that project as well, as you well recall, with Senator DeSaulnier that you were very supportive of, and that is one option, I think, as well, and the state tax credits is another one, and I think you know, probably both will be before the legislature this year.
Well, thank you for what you do. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Assemblymember Chu.
I want to thank Senator Roth's comments on this, and I think there are many of us in the Assembly, particularly those of us who are new, who are very eager to pick up some spears and get ready for a conversation about this. So look forward to the dialogue. I want to also thank Mr. Stivers for mentioning the bill that I've introduced. So the first bill that I've introduced this legislative session would be to increase by about $40 million what is available for state tax credits. And as someone who represents a city where we have seen in recent years thousands of our residents in San Francisco who have been either actually or constructively evicted due to a lack of affordable rental housing, this could not come soon enough. And I know that many of us around the state have been feeling this. The question I have for Mr. Stivers is similar to the question I'd asked our good HCD director, which is, what's the level of tax credits do you think our state would need to address what appears to be very intense demands up and down the state of California? I know, again, it's hard to ballpark the figure, but the feedback I've received around the $40 million number that I have put out is that that is not high enough, and wanted to get from you. If it were up to you, speaking as an individual, not necessarily for your boss, but what would be a guesstimate of what a number would look like?
The low-income housing tax credit program could clearly accommodate a couple $100 million more in state tax credits and put those to use. We would, At a $40 million level, we wouldn't need to make any program changes. We could get it out under our current structure. At a $200 or $300 million level, we would need to, both legislatively and regulatorily, probably do a few things. Right now, we put a little bit of tax credit, state tax credits into these projects, and it helps, kind of, like I said, spread the federal tax credits a little further. But if we're trying to fill that gap that I mentioned, we really would need to put a lot more state tax credits into each project, and we would probably need legislative change to accompany that as well. So the demand is there out there in the development sector. I mean, we have projects that are just ready to go, but for the funding. And so I think there's a lot, and a stable source of funding would, encourage developers to really go out and seek additional projects. Right now, until they get the ones funded that they have, why move forward with another project? So there's a very large demand out there in the market for affordable housing, in the developer side for financing to do more projects. And like I said, but we could easily, a couple $100 million could easily be put to use.
So $200-300 million we could.
Maybe more, but I think very comfortable with it. We could do that.
Okay, thank you.
I do have one question. What is the impact of AB 952 on the 4% tax credit, if any?
That was the special needs bill that we were talking about, right? So, special needs projects are really hard. So, the 4% and 9% have different, bring in a different amount of equity to the project, and as a result, what we generally see is that the 9% credits are used for those projects that have the deepest targeted affordable units, right? The ones who are getting to extremely low-income families and very low-income families. On the 4% side, those are traditionally used, except maybe for rehabilitation of existing projects. With respect to new construction, those 4% credits are really used for kind of a little bit higher income streams. Affordable units have to be below 60% of the area median income, but we'd probably see ranges more in the 50 to 60% range on the 4% side. And so for special needs housing, that's just not really an option. People with special needs generally are on SSI for income, if they have income at all. And so their ability to pay rents at $40 or $50, $800 or $900 a month is really not possible. So for special needs housing, we really try and focus that on the 9% tax credit program.
I gotcha. Thank you very much.
But that bump would allow us. So the 9% program wasn't enough for those special needs projects. That's where we're using the AB 952 state tax credits to sort of make those projects work. So, but they were coupled with the 9%.
Got it. Thank you. No other questions?